might have noticed that I am just a tiny bit excited about our featured speaker today, Noah Rasheta. When I first heard Noah's name, I thought, I've got to remember that name because I had people telling me all these great things he had said. And so I pictured a piece of bread with him standing on it and two of each kind of tomato, and that was my Noah Rasheta that helped me remember his name. So if that helps you, go for it. But now I know him well enough to remember his name without that. Noah is a husband. He's a father of some very cute children that he brought today. And he's also an entrepreneur. He loves Buddhist wisdom a lot. And he strives to make the world a better place while studying, embodying, and teaching the fundamentals of Buddhism, integrating Buddhist philosophy, modern science, humanism, and humor. He is the CEO of 3 companies, and he also runs a website and a really great podcast that I binge listened to at secularbuddhism.com. So today, with our time constraints, it will be a mere taste, I'm sure, of all the great things he has to share. And so if you enjoy it, you should check out his podcast. The first 5 episodes are intended to be in order, listen to repeatedly until you get the fundamentals, and all the rest are sort of choose your topic kind of podcast. When Noah has free time, he's out paragliding at the point of the mountain or flying around on his paramotor. And I would add that he's just a phenomenal human being, and I'm so happy to have him here today. He'll be speaking to us for about 20-25 minutes, and then he'll follow up with an audience Q&A. So while you're listening, if you have questions, save them for the end. But just make sure that it is a question and that it is brief so that we can hear what he has to answer. So please welcome Noah Rasheta.
Hello. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd today. One of the things I do when I stand on stage now, right around there, I look down real quick and make sure my fly's up. Because I did do that once, and about halfway through, it was a dance. Halfway through the dance, everyone's laughing, and I'm thinking, why is everyone laughing? And I didn't notice till I walked off the stage that my fly was down the whole time. So that won't happen today. All right, well, I'm excited to share some information with you guys about Buddhism in general, secular Buddhism specifically. So one of the things that I like to start with, there's a quote by the Dalai Lama, and he says, don't take what you learn from Buddhism to be a Buddhist, use it to be a better whatever you already are. And I like to emphasize that because there's nothing being sold here. There's nothing to convert to or to convert away from. This is just an introduction to another perspective on the many paths of how to live life. And I like to emphasize that because I don't want to ever sound like I'm trying to convince anyone of anything, because there is no convincing to be done. In fact, I like to say that the greatest thing you'll ever get studying Buddhism is that there's nothing to get. And when you get that, then you got it. So keep that in mind. There's nothing to get here. And I mean that. As Angie mentioned, I manufacture photography accessories. I have a company that manufactures 3 different brands of photography gear. And recently, I developed a new product, a gimbal that you put your phone on, and you hold it, and you can walk, and it keeps the video really steady. And when I was working on sourcing the parts for this new gimbal, I started working with a new supplier I hadn't worked with in China. All of my suppliers are in China. And they have a tendency to pick a Western name to interact with us Westerners because it's hard for us to say their names. So at one factory, I work with a Wyatt. At another factory, I work with Jason, and so on. So when I'm sourcing this new product, I meet, by email, I met Chris. And Chris is the head of sales for this specific factory. So we started working together, and weeks go by, and weeks turn into months. We've been working together, and I thought it's time to go to China and meet Chris, because we're getting ready to make a really big shipment. And so I flew out there. Chris had decided where to meet and when. And I show up the day and time for the meeting place, and I'm looking around and Chris isn't there. So I start pacing up and down, just buying time. 10, 15, 20 minutes go by, and I'm thinking, why isn't he here? So finally I decided to sit down and wait for Chris to show up. And the moment I sat down, there were these two young girls kind of on one end of that table just looking down on their phones, and one of them looks up at me and says, "Oh, hi, are you Noah? I'm Chris." And I was just baffled. It's not at all what I was expecting. I had it in my mind that Chris was a guy, and Chris wasn't. So for days after that experience, I kept thinking how, in a very literal way, I was blinded by my belief of what I thought reality was versus what reality actually was. And see, this is the secret to Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh says the secret to Buddhism is to remove all ideas and concepts in order for the truth to be able to reveal itself. Because we put ourselves in the position of taking reality, and then next to it we have our image of what reality should be, and we live in that world, and that oftentimes will blind us from seeing reality as it is. And that's kind of the core of what the Buddha taught. So Buddha was a teacher, and Buddha is a title. It just means awakened one or enlightened one. And I think there's a misconception sometimes in the West that he's a form of deity or something special, and he wasn't. He was just a teacher. And in that regards, I'd like to picture him as Dr. Buddha. Not religious Buddha. He was Dr. Buddha, who was a philosopher of the mind, studying the mind. And kind of what he proposed is the problem that we encounter in life is here. We create it. So everything that he taught was more of a philosophical approach to how we experience reality. And the difference with a medical approach versus a religious approach, with a medical approach, the idea is you have a problem, you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, here's the deal, this is what you have, this is what we can do about it, and here's what you need to do. And when it's done, it's done. You don't come back. Take this, go, and don't come back. And that was kind of the approach he took. So I see Buddhism as a philosophical way of life that is more similar to a medical practice or a psychological practice. You go to see the psychologist, and you don't want to go and then have to go over and over and over. You want to go and find out what was wrong and then be done. So when we have the time to take a look at the way we see things, that's when the way we see things changes. And Buddhism focuses on helping us to understand the way that we're seeing things. So rather than presenting reality as this esoteric set of rules that or a reality that you need to believe in, it's saying the problem is the reality that you believe in. Very much like me looking for Chris. The problem had nothing to do with reality. The problem had everything to do with the reality that I had created and was expecting to encounter in that moment. Buddhism takes a very pragmatic approach to reality. And there's a story of a man who was shot with a poisoned arrow. And he's out in the forest, he gets shot with this poisoned arrow, and he's trying to decide what to do. And he immediately assembles all of his people, his entourage, and he sends people off in different directions. He says, you go find out, what kind of wood is this, and what kind of feather is this? The arrow's just protruding out of his chest. And he's really concerned with all the aspects of the arrow, sends everyone off. By the time they come back, he's dead. And that's the story. And when the story was taught, the moral of the story is the situation at hand is that you've been shot with an arrow. And nothing else matters other than the situation at hand, which is you were shot with an arrow. How much time do you have left? What do you do with that time? And that's kind of the way Buddhism approaches the situation at hand in life, is that in life we experience suffering. There is suffering in life. There's no way around it. And when difficulties arise, and these can come in the form of sickness, old age, I think the ultimate one is dealing with death. But they also manifest in small things, being stuck at the red light when you're late for work, losing your job, when these things happen, we experience suffering. And the nature of suffering is that when we want life to be other than it is, we're going to suffer. That's the definition of suffering. And if you look at any moment of your life when you've experienced suffering, you'll know, you can analyze it and see that the source of suffering at that point is that something is the way that we don't want it. And because we don't want it that way, we experience suffering. Now, another misconception, I think, with Buddhism at times is the idea of focusing on how to minimize or eliminate suffering. You think, well, that's not possible. I'm going to suffer if I'm in a car crash and I'm hurt and I'm experiencing pain, I'm experiencing suffering. And they'll say, like, what are you saying, that if I sit there and meditate, I don't experience pain? And no, the answer is that's not the type of suffering we're talking about. It's self-inflicted suffering. So we usually talk about suffering kind of in these two categories. There's the suffering that you experience no matter what you do or don't do, and then there's the suffering that you experience that's inflicted by the ideas or concepts or beliefs that you hold around that. And that's the type of suffering that Buddhism really focuses on. Buddhism is anchored in the present moment. There's nothing more important than now in Buddhism. And the reason is because in the understanding of interdependence, all things are interdependent and connected. The present moment is here because of the past. The way the past took place has allowed the present to be exactly what it is. So we see that as interdependence. And by that same understanding, the future, however it will be, every infinite combination of what the future can hold is contained right here in the present moment. And it's the actions that we're taking now that shape how that future will be. So there's no focus on the existential in Buddhism. It's like the arrow, there's no need to waste time finding out what kind of feather is this, who was the person who shot it, why did he shoot it. There's no focus on that. The focus is, hey, you're experiencing suffering. Let's focus on the here and the now. So I kind of wanted to present the 4 overall teachings in Buddhism, represented kind of like in this medical diagnosis I was talking about. Imagine you're going to see the doctor, and this is Dr. Buddha, and you show up, and here's what he has to say. He says, well, I'm going to diagnose the problem. The problem is that in life there is suffering. This is what they call the first noble truth in Buddhism. In life there is suffering. In life difficulties arise. It's not personal. You don't need to get bent out of shape. There was no way to prevent it. Sometimes the suffering that we experience comes because we think if we do this and if we avoid this, then life turns out good. And that's just not true, because life is not a cosmic justice system. It doesn't impart equally and say, oh, good guy, here you get this. Bad guy, you get this. It doesn't really work that way. And that's why you see good things happening to bad people or to good people, and bad things happening to bad people and to good people. There's no discrimination there. Things happen. So that's the problem that we're diagnosed with, and then it's universal. And I think that part is important, because when something happens, we have a tendency to say, why me? This is not fair. Why is this happening to me? And if you spent a little time looking at anyone else's story, you'll discover that they also experience suffering. The scale may be different, the circumstances may be different, but this is universal. And it can be powerful to understand that, because when I'm experiencing something painful in life, I can look around and recognize, you know what that's like. I don't know what you've been through, but I know that you know what it's like to suffer. And this is a universal teaching. So the second part is identifying the underlying causes. So this is where the doctor says, okay, so here's the problem. In life there is suffering, and the reason there's suffering is because of what we call attachment or clinging. Again, this is wanting life to be other than it is. There's a form of wisdom, I think, that comes in having the ability to immediately be flexible with our attitude. Because I think another misconception sometimes with Buddhism is, okay, these guys just they're just so chill that they don't plan anything and just go through life, whatever happens, happens. And that's not true. The difference is this: you can plan and you make your plans, have your goals, do whatever, and the moment life changes it on you, you change with it. You say, okay, new course of action, new set of goals, new set of whatever I need to do. Because it's that moment that you cling to what was, you experience suffering. Like that wasn't supposed to happen. And you can spend days, weeks, months, even years clinging to an outcome that is long in the past now because I cannot let go of the reality that shifted. It's not what it was anymore. It's what is. It's always what is. So the underlying cause of suffering is attachment or clinging. So the next thing the doctor says is, okay, we're going to determine the prognosis here. And the doctor says this is a treatable condition. We can treat the causes of suffering. Now, another misconception here, sometimes they think, okay, we're not treating suffering. The point is that the first noble truth was that there is suffering. You can't get rid of it. So wanting there to not be suffering is suffering. It's going to create more suffering. So the prognosis here is we need to treat the underlying causes of suffering and find where am I attaching? Where is there attachment? So then that leads to the prescription, which is non-attachment. There needs to be a change in our perspective of reality. And this is where a flexible attitude becomes key, because life is like a Tetris game, right? Have you guys played Tetris? And the pieces show up, and what happens when they show up? You have limited ability to move it left or right and spin it around and hurry because it's moving, and then it locks in and there's the next piece. Now, we go through life thinking that we have control of what comes next. And really, we don't, right? I mean, there's limited control in life. If I decide to go out and rob a bank, guess what might come next? I might be in prison. And we would say that's karma, but karma in the sense that karma means action. So another big misconception in Buddhism is the idea of karma as a cosmic justice system. What goes around comes around. It doesn't work that way. Karma means if I just do this with that phone, it's going to fall. And if it falls, it might break. And if it breaks, whoever owns this might be mad at me. So that's karma in action. I'm seeing a sequence of events that take place because of something that was done. But it's not about good or bad. Doesn't mean that was bad that I did it, because maybe once it broke, they went and found out they get a new one because the new one just came out and it's free. And so we don't get to judge and decide good or bad. That's a dangerous game. But that's karma. It just means action. And so the prescription here is this change of perspective. This is what in Buddhism they call the Eightfold Path. And there are 8 areas of life that you really focus on trying to change your perspective, because it's always about perspective. It's not about acquiring a new way to see the world. It's about focusing on what am I seeing now that's actually distorting what is. So when I started out, I talked about Chris and not seeing Chris. The problem was the belief that Chris was a man blinded me from seeing Chris as a woman, right? So in the Eightfold Path, what you're doing is kind of focusing that on 8 different areas of life where you think, in what ways are my ideas or my concepts limiting me from seeing reality? And you can experience this in so many little areas of life. Imagine somebody who, actually I'll tell you a quick story. A couple of months ago, I was in Phoenix doing a workshop like this. And during one of the breaks, I sat down with someone. He was sitting kind of in the middle, and as I kind of glanced back and forth, every time I would see him, he was like I was supposed to know him. So I kept waving, and then during the break, he came and sat down with me and was asking me, how's your family? How's this? So I thought, oh, he does know me. Okay, so I'm trying my best to pretend like I know him too, and I didn't know him. And about 10 minutes into that process, the break's over. I go up to keep talking, and then the next break, same thing happens. He comes up again and starts asking me more questions. And then he was like, I'm kind of confused. And I said, yeah, me too. And he said, I thought, I'm trying to remember what he brought up, but something about my wife. Something about, I thought your wife was here, there. And I was like, how do you know my wife? And he's like, yeah, Anessa. And I said, oh, my wife is Giselle, who's here. Anessa is my twin brother's wife, who lives in Phoenix. So that solved the problem. And I said, okay, you know my twin brother. He's like, oh, you're not Nick? And I said, no, I'm Noah. He's like, oh, I was thinking, why is Noah being such a jerk? He's like pretending like he doesn't know me. And that's happened multiple times in life, being a twin. I've gotten good at just, if somebody knows or acts like they know me, I try to play along because they might know him. And he does the same backwards. But I thought about that. In that instance, for him the suffering he was experiencing was, why is he not treating me like I'm his friend? And this went on for minutes. It wasn't a big deal. But for minutes because he told me after, he was thinking, what did I do? Why are you mad at me? Why are you treating me like you don't really know me? And that was completely self-inflicted suffering, right? And it comes not from the circumstances, it comes from the beliefs attached to the circumstances. He thought that I didn't care to be friendly to him, and the reality was I just didn't know him. And how many times does that happen in life where a certain situation will present itself, we make meaning of it right away because we're really good at that. But the meaning that we make ends up being the very problem because now we're caught in the meaning that we've made and we'll never know how it actually is because it's not about what is, it's about what we think is. So Buddhism is trying to take a step back and say the problem is how you view things. And it kind of compares this to if you were wearing tinted glasses with a green tint, everything looks kind of green. And the problem with that is you don't know you're wearing glasses. You know, the tint represents our ideas and our concepts. So to come along and say, oh, here, I'll fix this, put on these yellow shades, well, it's just going to complicate the problem, right? Or, well, that didn't work, try these red ones. Well, that didn't work, try these blue ones. And the problem is going to become more intense. What Buddhism is saying is, hey, look at what shades you're wearing and remove them. We're not trying to attach any new concepts or ideas or beliefs. We're trying to remove them and say, if you didn't have any of those, then what's there? What do you see if you let go of your ideas and your concepts? And this is where Thich Nhat Hanh's quote, the secret to Buddhism is to let go of ideas and concepts. That's when truth can be seen. And the cool thing there is you might be thinking, okay, well, that sounds intriguing. What is this truth you're talking about? Well, you'll never get a concrete answer in Buddhism about that. The truth is the truth. Like, well, what's that? Well, it's what it is. So good luck looking for that. But I really wanted to emphasize the approach in Buddhism is much more of a medical diagnosis. There's a parable that the Buddha teaches towards the end of his life. He ended up living about 80 years. He built up a following of monks with the sole intent to go out and teach what he was teaching, which is mindfulness, being mindful of the present moment. So he's talking to them, and they're by the edge of a river, and he says, okay, I want you guys to think about this. If there was someone on that side of the river, and they're trying to come to this side of the river, and there's no way to cross, they decide to spend time building a raft. So a considerable amount of time and energy goes into building the raft, and then they're on the raft and they float their way over and they finally make it to this side. Now that they're here, do you think we should continue our journey should we bring the raft with us or do we leave it behind? And they all kind of sit there thinking about it for a minute and they're like, well, it wouldn't make sense to bring it because you don't need it anymore. And then he goes on to tell them, this is how you are to view the teachings, the Dharma is what they call it, the teachings of Buddhism. He's like, these are tools. It's like going to a doctor, finding out what you need is Tylenol, then you take Tylenol and you're like, hey, that worked. Well, it doesn't mean take it every day now. He's saying let go. And that's what he was telling his monks. You know, once this has worked and you've seen the nature of reality, which is that there's nothing to see, remember I told you when you get it, it's that there's nothing to get, you don't need to attach to it. Because the ultimate form of attachment is attachment to non-attachment. You think, well, I don't want to attach to anything. Okay, I'm going to make sure I don't attach to anything. Well, now I'm attached to non-attachment. And that's even harder than the attachment before. I like to imagine, being on a hamster wheel, and you're running, and maybe this is the hamster wheel of materialism. And you're thinking, if I can run hard enough and run fast enough, I'll get whatever I'm supposed to get. And for some people, that's money, it's power or fame, but ultimately those are all masks of trying to get happiness, right? I think that's what we're all after. And the mistaken idea that happiness is found in those things is like being on a hamster wheel, and you run harder and faster than ever before, and you still don't get there. And then someone comes along and says, hey, you're on a hamster wheel. You'll never get there chasing those things. Now, if you're wise enough to understand that, you'll say, okay, then I'll step off. It's not that you can stay on, go ahead. It's not that it's a bad thing, but if you're tired and you don't want to run, step off, because you're never going to find it. Now, the mistake someone will make is say, okay, I'm off of that. Materialism, I'm done. Now I'm on the spiritual hamster wheel, and here I go again. And you'll never get there. And that's something I really enjoy about Buddhism, is the parable of the raft is to remind us the where you are in life and everything that it took to get there, it's always here, and it's always now. And when we look back at the past and we regret the raft that we were on that got us to here, it's silly, because it's what was. And if we sit there and we resent it, what good does it do in the present moment? Or it could hinder the progress of your journey if you put that heavy raft on your back and here you go moving forward into the desert with a raft on your back. It wouldn't make sense. And that's kind of the approach that Buddhism takes to reality. The situation at hand is that in life there is suffering. The suffering comes because we don't want there to be suffering. We cling and we attach, and in that process, you can't escape it. And I want to reemphasize the separation of suffering into two categories, because I'm not talking about the suffering of losing a lost one, the suffering of losing a job. You experience suffering when these things happen. But now, what if that's happening and you're suffering and now you're mad that you're mad? Well, that's just silly, because now you're double mad and you didn't need to be. So that's kind of what Buddhism is saying is that the self-inflicted suffering that we experience, that's optional. And that when you're ready to let go, it's gone. And until you let go, it's not gone. It can't be. You're attached to it. Now, the other kind of suffering, that's a part of life. That's the experience of being human, is that we experience suffering. And if we don't want to suffer, then you're going to suffer because you don't want to suffer and you can't get away from it. So that, in a nutshell, is the very first discourse that the Buddha taught, was the discourse on the Four Noble Truths, where he talks about the situation at hand is suffering. The reason is because there's attachment or clinging. We can work on the causes of suffering. We're not trying to get rid of suffering, but the causes of suffering, attachment and clinging. And we do that with the prescription of the Eightfold Path. That would be an all-day workshop just to talk about that one. But I think the key to that one is the very first spoke of the wheel. If you've ever seen, the symbol of Buddhism is a wheel with 8 spokes. That represents the Eightfold Path. And the spokes are all equal. It's not a sequence where you go, I'm going to master this, then I'm going to master that. It doesn't work that way. You're always focusing on any of the spokes. And the first one that they teach you is called wise perspective. And it kind of goes back to this idea of the way that you're seeing the world is different than the way that the world is. And what's clouding that, your tinted shades, are your beliefs and your concepts and your ideas that you've built around reality. So that's what we focus on in Buddhism, is not acquiring anything new. It's how do we remove the ideas and concepts that we have in place that are clouding our view of reality. So that's the presentation I had. And if you want to learn more about those concepts and what they are, then, that's a whole nother discussion. But this is a brief introduction to what Buddhism is and what it's not. So instead of thinking of it as a religion, think of it as a medical practice, or very much like a psychologist. It's a study of the mind. And thank you guys for your time. So we're going to move in next to the question and answer portion of it, if you guys have any questions. Okay, good question. What does the practice of meditation do to help with that non-attachment? The idea of mindfulness is tricky, awareness and mindfulness, because It's like you're supposed to be aware, but what are you supposed to be aware of? Well, I don't know. So, in the world of knowledge, there are the things that we know, the things that we know that we don't know, and then there are the things that we don't know that we don't know. And mindfulness is getting us into that third realm of the things that we don't even know that we don't know. And to just say, hey, be mindful, it's like saying, well, hey, run inside and find what you're looking for. It's like, but what am I looking for? And you're grabbing things like, is this what I'm looking for? I don't know. How am I supposed to know? So mindfulness, what we do in mindfulness practice is we practice just being with what is. And the biggest misconception with meditation is that it's supposed to do something. Something's supposed to happen. And it's not, because thinking something's supposed to happen has been the problem all along. The problem is that I can't just be with what is. What is, I have my idea of what is. So when we practice mindfulness meditation, we're doing nothing. We sit there and we just observe. I guess it's the practice of shifting the mindset from thinking mind to observing mind. And you sit there and you observe your thoughts. And you don't control your thoughts because you are your thoughts. So using thoughts to control thoughts is like trying to bite your teeth with your own teeth. It's just not going to work. So you observe, and the more time you spend observing the thoughts, what you come to understand is the nature of reality, which is that thoughts come and go. They're not there, then they're there, they linger, and then they're gone, replaced by another thought. And in Buddhism, that's what we call impermanence. Nothing's permanent. And sitting and observing your thoughts will teach you, more than anything, the nature of impermanence. Because you can be attached to a thought, and in 1 second, that thought's been replaced by another one. You're like attached to that one, and that's the nature of reality. So, meditation plays a crucial role in this process in Buddhism, but it's because you're trying to see the nature of reality and just be with what is, but you're not trying to accomplish anything in the process, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anyone else?
You mentioned that, I think the example of following that perhaps it's not good or bad, and that's dangerous. And my question is from Secular Buddhism perspective, at any point do you make determinations of what's good and bad? I feel like you need some of that, right?
Yeah, good question. So he's asking about I mentioned there's no good or bad. So I'll answer this with a quick parable first. There's a Taoist parable of a horse. And there's an old man, a farmer, and he's out in the field and a horse shows up out of the blue. So he takes the horse and he puts it in the corral, and the neighbor comes running over and he says, "You got a horse, that's amazing, this is good." And the old man just says, "Well, who knows what is good and what is bad?" And he goes about doing his thing. The horse breaks out of the corral, runs away, neighbor comes running over, "Your horse escaped, this is horrible." And he's like, "Who knows what is good and what is bad?" And he goes out, keeps farming. The horse comes back with 3 additional horses. So he takes them, puts them all in the corral, fixes the corral. Neighbor comes running. "This is amazing. You have 4 horses now." And he says, "Who knows what is good and what is bad?" He goes about doing his thing. And then the next day, his son is trying to tame one of the horses, falls off and breaks his leg. And the neighbor comes running over. "Your only son, your helper, this is horrible. He has a broken leg." He takes his son, puts him in his house. He says, "Who knows what is good and what is bad?" Goes about doing his thing. The next day, the army comes into town, and they're conscripting all the youth, and they take everyone but his son because he has a broken leg. And the neighbor comes running over, and he's like, "Hey," and then he turns around and says, "Who knows what is good and what is bad?" And he leaves. And the story is trying to teach us that life is a game of Tetris. And when the piece shows up, it's not about good or bad. The square isn't better than the bar. If I needed a bar, then my perspective determines that the bar is better than the square. So the dangerous part of this game is that from our perspective, my good and bad is different than your good or bad, and our society's good or bad is different than another society's good or bad. It becomes really muddy because good or bad is always subjective. It's based on perspective. Now, there may be some overall topics that harming others is detrimental. So in Buddhism, the code of ethics really starts and stops at the golden rule. It's the notion of don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you. And that was taught in one of the early discourses by the Buddha. And that's really the only notion of good or bad, but it's never delineated as good or bad. It's more of don't cause harm, because good or bad is always going to be subjective. Does that answer your question? Kind of. Was that a good answer? Yeah. Okay, good question. Why secular Buddhism? Because the secularbuddhism.com domain was available and I bought it. So the thing is, Buddhism is secular. It's a non-theistic tradition. So by its very nature, it's secular. But what I found when I started studying Buddhism is that Buddhism alone carries a lot of religious connotation. People were saying, I don't need another ism in my life. And so by attaching secular Buddhism, only clarified that there isn't a catch here. It's presented in a way to be disarming from the very get-go. But the reality is Buddhism is secular in nature. There is no such thing as dogmatic Buddhism, for example. Or at least, I mean, maybe there is, because there's such thing as anything out there. But most Buddhist traditions, whether it be Zen or Tibetan or any of the schools of thought of Buddhism, what you'll find is they are typically non-dogmatic approaches to trying to understand the nature of reality. Does that answer your question? I call it secular Buddhism because for the audience that I typically speak to, I think it's more intriguing. It's like, oh, I'm willing to learn about that. Whereas if it was just, hey, this is a thing on Buddhism, they might be like, I'm not interested in a religion. And the truth is, it's the same thing. So it's a marketing thing. Even though there's nothing to market, right? Let's go here and then you. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And we're supposed to allow ourselves to hurt while avoiding suffering. And as we kind of approach this the whole time, it's a single foot. What are some tips to differentiate between hurt and suffering?
Good question. So to differentiate between pain and suffering, were those the two words? Or hurt and suffering? Yeah, it's a good question because it becomes a matter of what we define as suffering and what we define as pain. But typically I would view it like this. Pain and hurt is what we don't control. And in Buddhism, they teach this with a parable of two arrows. And it's like you've been shot with one arrow. That's pain. That's hurt. You can't do anything about it. But then the second arrow is the arrow that you take out of your quiver and you're like, I got shot. Why did you shoot me here? This really hurts. And you're stabbing yourself with that second arrow. And so self-inflicted suffering is what, when Buddhism is talking about suffering, they're talking about self-inflicted suffering. So for example, you save up money and you finally buy the car of your dreams, and when you're on your way to go show your friends, you crash, you run into the car in front of you because you weren't paying attention. The pain that you feel from the steering wheel on your chest, that's pain. When you get out of the car and you look at the car and it's totaled, that's also pain. That's the pain of loss. Thinking all the time and energy that went into saving up for this car, that's also pain, and it's real. And then there's this third kind, which is a little more difficult to understand. It's the pain that you experience thinking, everyone's going to think I'm an idiot because I crashed my brand new car. And that's also pain, but that's self-inflicted pain, because that comes from our perspective. We don't know what people are going to think. But so when we're talking about pain and suffering, I think it's one of the most difficult things to do while we're experiencing suffering is what part of my pain and suffering is self-inflicted and what part of it is just pain and suffering. Because the pain and suffering that's natural, you don't get rid of. In fact, by wanting to get rid of it, you're making it worse. So we usually say, to be with it. When you're experiencing difficult emotions, the way around it is to be with it and to allow yourself to experience what you're experiencing, because it's trying to avoid it. Anger's a common one, and you think, well, I'm mad now that I'm mad because I'm not supposed to be mad. Well, that's the problem, is you think you're not supposed to be mad. Mad is a natural emotion that we experience. So is pain. So I think spending time, this is where mindfulness comes in, where you would want to spend time deconstructing the scenario that you're in to try to understand what part of this pain is self-inflicted. Because that part I don't want, but the other part, I want to be with it. I want to feel hurt. I want to feel pain because this is natural. And it's by allowing it to be what it is the nature of impermanence is that before you know it, it's gone, and it's replaced by something new. And most of our problems come from putting up this barrier, thinking, we don't want this, we don't need this, and you resist it and you resist it. Then it festers for years and years. So that's kind of does that make sense? A little bit? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm sad that I'm sad is more sad than just being sad. Yeah.
So what you're describing sounds almost like a psychology, like Jedi mind tricks, but what about salvation? If somebody asks you, are you saved, how would you respond?
Well, the typical Buddhist approach to salvation is, I'm not saved because I never needed to be saved in the first place. So if there's no need for salvation if there's no one who's in a place of non-salvation. The Buddhist, and we call this Buddha nature, is the idea that the way that you are has been and always will be perfect, because the nature of impermanence is that all things change. So the only reason that the me that's the me now thinks I'm not the right me is when it's in comparison to a previous me or a future me. But those are illusory, because there is no past me or future me. There's only the present me. So you're perfect the way that you are. You know, in Buddhism, there would never be talk of salvation because there's nothing to be saved from. If anything, it's salvation from ignorance. It would be the salvation from the ignorance of thinking you needed to be saved that's the equivalent of awakening in Buddhism. So when they say, you know, the Buddha was awakened or enlightened, it doesn't mean anything supernatural. It's nothing. In fact, it's so simple that when you try to explain it to someone, they usually don't. They'll reject it because it's like, well, that's dumb. In that case, everyone's a Buddha. It's like, yes, that's what we're trying to teach. Everyone is a Buddha. You are awakened, and if you're not, it's just that you don't realize that you're awakened. That's the only difference. Everyone's awakened, some just know it. So does that answer your question? Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. So attachment to people. You know, Buddhism is always talking about non-attachment. And I think it's important to clarify what we mean by non-attachment isn't that we don't own things, it's that things don't own you. So in terms of relationships with people, Buddhism is always anchored in the present moment. So my attachment to the people I love is anchored in the present. And as long as it's anchored in the present, there's nothing wrong with that, because that's actually not attachment, because I'm changing and they're changing. So as we're both constantly changing, I'm accepting who they are, they're accepting who I am, but attachment comes in the form of who you were is not who you are now, and I want who you were. That's attachment in a relationship. If you're truly present with someone, there can't be attachment, because the moment you attach, they've changed. I mean, and I'm literally, like 10 seconds later, you've generated new cells, your hair's grown, however much more, like in a physical, literal way, changes at the constant. So you can't attach because you're constantly re-engaging with the present version of you and the present version of me. So that's the misconception, is that we don't attach to people, but we're talking about attachment in past and present and who you are and who I think you should be. That's attachment. But allowing you to be you and me be me is a healthy relationship that we strive for in Buddhism. Cool. Thank you. Would a Buddhist keep a photo album? Yes, as long as you never look at it. No. I have probably 3,000 photos in my phone and videos. And so again, looking back and having a fond memory of the past is different than attaching to the past. Attachment to the past becomes unhealthy because I'm comparing it to the present. So non-comparison is the key here. As long as you're not comparing, there's no problem. I can look at my past and I take moments that at one point I thought were sad moments. When this happened, it was a sad thing. And now I can look back at that moment with compassion, because I'm like, that was a unique moment in my life. I'll probably never experience that again. And I hopefully never experience that again. But I'm not comparing it to the present, saying, that one's bad, this one's good. Now I'm attaching the two. So non-attachment is about non-comparison. But it doesn't mean that you can't reminisce about the past and have fond memories of loved ones or have a photo album. Does that make sense? Are we?
Yeah, we're over a little bit. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I told you this would happen. Right? So let's give Noah another.
Thank you, guys.